Test 1, 2. Hello. How's everybody doing? Welcome. Thank you for coming out. We've had a couple months off, and good to see you, Brian. Good to see everyone. We've got people online, and this is actually a pretty good turnout, I think. I wasn't quite sure what to expect if the break would confuse too many people, but I appreciate it. My name is Enoch. I'm founder of Defending Utah and the National American Committees Association, and we are here because we all have a duty to our country. And that duty is, usually a lot of people think of that as, well, my duty is I'll just vote and then that's enough. Those of us who have been around long enough kind of know that there's a lot more going on than just figuring out who you vote for. But what we're really here for, after our years of experience kind of in the trenches and figuring out how do we preserve our liberty, what do we do for our country, and we feel like we tried everything. We spent about a decade trying everything and learning the pros and cons. But why we're here tonight is to fundamentally preserve knowledge. Preserve knowledge on how our country is supposed to work, how it was designed to work, how our founding fathers set up this country. You can love this country to death all you want, but it is just a law of nature that as we lose the understanding of how it's supposed to work, no matter how much we love it, it's going to still fall apart. We have to know how it's supposed to work so that we can preserve the country's original intent. Now that is easier said than done, because it's a lot of work to work with your local officials and to figure out how you self-govern a community, because sometimes your local officials won't respond to you. And that's okay that it's hard, and that's okay that we don't win a lot of the times. But a lot of times we do, and they're usually small wins and small victories that are not announced on the news and with not a lot of fanfare. But no matter what we do for our country, we must have the knowledge of how it's supposed to work. You can't get our information from headlines. We can't get our information from popular culture. We have to get it from the law, from the original intent, ultimately from the laws of nature. And so this is why we're here, because we understand there's a great lacking in the understanding of how our country is supposed to work and what our founding fathers set up. So if nothing else happens from you coming to this class or from people who learn and watch this recording later, if nothing else comes from it, just the fact that now you know how it's supposed to be is a lot. And it may not be in our generation where we see all the successes that we want to see. Maybe it will be. I think it's very possible. That's why we have our program. We have a manual for the American Committees Association. I've got some books here. We can talk about that. But that is, you don't want to get disappointed just because we don't see the results we want to see all the time. My point is, preserve the knowledge. Know how the country is supposed to work. And I think we need to set up a couple more chairs maybe. That's a great problem to have as more people come. But if you get nothing out of this, if you know how the country is supposed to work and you can pass it on to your children and you can share it with your neighbor, that is a win. That is how truth is perpetuated in a society that is trying so hard to establish lies. Okay, to establish lies about how our country works. We are not a democracy. That's line number one. Very basic, simple thing, right? That seems so simple. But that is one of the most commonly misunderstood things today in all of our schools, churches, institutions, government itself. But then there's 100 more things we have to know beyond that truth. Okay, maybe 1,000 more things, maybe infinite. I don't know. But preserve that knowledge. So Dr. Bradley is a wealth of this knowledge. He has a PhD in the Constitution, and he has studied the founders more than anyone I've ever met in my entire life. And once you learn everything from him, it is incumbent upon us to preserve, improve upon what we know, and then perpetuate it. The founders did say that they knew they didn't figure everything out, but what they did figure out, they got right. And so they said it is incumbent on our successors to preserve and perpetuate what we've done. They said someday people will figure out what we were actually trying to do, and they will move the needle forward. So learn what they gave us first. Don't try to fix something that's not broken, like rewrite the Constitution in an Article 5 convention or any other what needs. Understand what they did and then build upon that truth. And so that's why we have Dr. Bradley here today. We've been going through the Constitution line by line, and we went through all the articles, and we have all these videos recorded in our members area online. If on our YouTube channel, if you subscribe and become a premium subscriber, we also preserve all these classes on there as well. So, but this is always available for free in person and even online if you email and ask for a coupon code if you ever need to do that. So that being said, I'll introduce Dr. Bradley, and we'll move on. As I said, we've been talking about the Constitution line by line. Now we're getting into the Bill of Rights. And so when we're done with that, we may just start over because there's always so much to go through, or we'll kind of take it from there. So thank you.
Tell me when we'll go from there. All right. Okay. Everybody should be all fresh and ready to go because you've had a couple of months off. Buckle your seatbelts. No, it isn't so challenging. It's something simple enough that I grasp it, I think. If I can, anybody can. And so I would think that it's like Jefferson said, that it's not a metaphysical thing. It's plain English. The founders said what they meant, and they meant what they said. It's something that all those words have definitions, and those words, they can only mean what they meant in the day they were written. You can't say, oh, well, republic means democracy now. They knew very clearly what they were saying. And so this thing about a Bill of Rights, we last time we met, we finished up the Articles of the Constitution. And there was a big, big, big debate about getting it ratified. In fact, it came to a point where it looked like there would not be a ratification of the Constitution. There was a big roadblock. And it came right from as they came out of the convention, even before the convention ended, there was a big bump in the road. And so we're going to see kind of where that went and how we got to where we got a Bill of Rights. And I'm so grateful for everybody that dug in their heels and say, we ain't going nowhere until this is fixed. In spite of the fact that it looked like an impossible dream at the time. So basically what they did is they began meeting in the middle of May 1787 in Philadelphia. They met in private. They didn't come out on the front porch every afternoon and say, here's what we did today, and here's what that idiot over there said, and here's what I said, and you can believe me but not him. And there was none of that press release stuff. They met and they were able to discuss openly and exchange ideas and change their ideas. If people came in and says, by golly, it's going to be this, somebody else said, by golly, it's going to be that, and as they discussed it, they realized, well, this is what it's going to be, okay? And the thing was that the people that did this, a lot of them had big egos. A lot of them were brilliant individuals. A lot of them had some pretty strongly held positions. But as they exchanged ideas, they came to understand that under the inspiration and hand of God, I think they got a softening of hearts where needed and a hardening of hearts where needed to be able to stick strong in some of the things. And so, boy, they came out of this. It was a knockdown, drag out. And through the summer, it's a long, hot summer, and you guys have seen the pictures of these guys in their formal attire, the wool suits. I've got a wool jacket on tonight, and I'm glad of it because of the weather, but my goodness, if you can imagine, if you've been in Philadelphia in the summer, hot and humid, and they didn't have any people with, air conditioning in the windows or somebody standing outside, listening in because of an open window. I mean, it was a pretty challenging circumstance. Yes. Okay. I broke this one already. It's kind of what happens when they want.
Okay, there.
Testing.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Ooh, I got a fuzzy head on it this time. If I could figure out, maybe that'll come on this way. Sound check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Check, check, check. Okay. We better now? Holy cow. Okay. So anyway, they had this arduous task through the summer of 1787. And it looked like it was going to fail even in the middle of it. And so Ben Franklin, everybody says, he's a deist. He didn't really believe in God or anything like that. He was really quite a Christian that's not well known. And when Thomas Paine wrote a paper later that was highly critical of Christianity, and he showed it to Ben Franklin and wanted his input. And Ben Franklin says, fold it up, put it away, and don't show it to anybody because it's going to cause nothing but trouble. So anyway, he was a very wise statesman, and he had this little time in the middle of the summer that it looked like it was going to fail. And he says, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, meaning God's notice, is it probable that an empire can arise without his aid? And he begged leave that they have prayer every day. Now, in those days, they had many individuals that made their living by the preaching of the gospel, if you will. And so they didn't have any budget for that, and so they didn't hire somebody to bring them in. They didn't want to offend anybody and say, well, we need you to come in and pray, but we need it to be for free. But all of the men that were there were pretty high level of religiosity themselves, and they kind of doubled down on their prayers. And they went forward from there with increased humility. Now, some of you know that every Thursday night I do a webinar, and I spend a few hours on the radio every week too. And in the run-up to the election that just occurred this week, I had a number of times I suggested that we have a day of prayer. You pick your day, you pick who you're involving, but pray. We need God's imposition on some of these things. And we did that running up to the election. And then last night on my webinar and this morning on the radio, I said, okay, now it's time to double down. We've got a regime changing that's going to go into a new regime, and we need God's hand in this thing. Soften hearts, open doors, make the way, and if people will each take the time, like Ben Franklin suggested, if a sparrow can't fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that we're going to be able to continue this whole republic if we don't have his assistance? And I would submit that we don't. We don't have a chance of continuing if we don't have his assistance. So anyway, at the end of the convention, September 17th, they signed it, everybody went out the door, and you've heard about how a woman said to Ben Franklin, well, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? And he said, a democracy if you can keep it, right? No? No? You didn't hear it that way? I thought I'd see if you're awake. He said, a republic if you can keep it. But Tamara and I have stood in Constitution Hall with the docent or the guide or whatever you want to call them telling it, and they said a democracy if you can keep it. So we have had a complete flip of this thing, and we have lost our way to the core. And that's what's fabricated within the education system, within the media system, with the political aisles. Every opportunity we are having everything, not just on the republic democracy thing, the most basic fundamental thing. Just tell you another little quick story. A few years ago, and we got to start the thing because I do have to leave tonight. But I was asked by some people that had the ear of a number of Utah legislators. The legislative session was starting soon, and they said, we would like to get a set of fundamental principles that should be taught of U.S. civics within Utah's schools. Could you develop a set of principles that you think are absolutely essential to be understood? Could I? How much time should I take and how many pages? No, we just need a few fundamental principles. So I don't remember what I gave them. I gave them probably 25 or 30. I mean, very basic fundamental things that needed to be taught and understood if we were going to preserve the nation. The entire legislative session happened. It was a knockdown, drag out. Everybody that had any opinion expressed it. And what came out of it, they could not agree on one principle. The first and most fundamental they tried to get through was it is a republic. And the legislature would not agree on that, in spite of what it says in Article 4. I mean, in spite of what it says in Utah's Constitution, in spite of anything the Founding Fathers did, it would not go through the Utah legislature. And so this is something that there's a real deep resistance to. So Franklin said a republic if you can keep it. But then the battle really started. Hearts and minds of the people. And there was a lot of founders that were like, what's going to happen? It ain't going to work. And we're not going to, oh man, all that work, what are we going to do? And others said, you know what? It took us a real intense review and study to come to where we came. This is new to these people that we're suddenly making public. Give them a chance. And so there was, on the one hand, everybody was panicked, and on the other hand, everybody was saying it'll work out fine. So one of the big things that came out of that is the title of this presentation. And rather than jump right into the Bill of Rights, I thought you might want to hear a little bit of the story that went behind that, because in our minds, it's a no-brainer. We got this baby and we got it snookered and everything's good. No, it wasn't. And some of the most brilliant minds of the American founding era were dead set opposed to a Bill of Rights. Why? How could anybody do that? Well, it was because from a legalistic perspective, if you leave something off of a list, you did it on purpose. Let's say I wrote a will and I left my favorite shotgun off the will by an oversight or I don't know, however. And so when it comes, I'm dead, and they're doing the will reading, and the shotgun's not given to anybody. It was left off on purpose. That's kind of from a legalistic perspective how this goes. And they were concerned that if they tried to list a Bill of Rights, now I've got a kind of a supplemental information at the end of this. We probably won't get to it because I talk too much. But I've got a list of some things the United Nations has put together about rights. And it's very, very interesting. Your definition of some things there and my definition may be a whole bunch different. But they've got them on there, and it's this dozens of statements about rights. And not a one of them is defensible. Well, hardly. Because they're so, it's opinion based. But at any rate, some were saying, you can't list your rights. They're innumerable. See, I'm not wearing shoelaces right now, but as I look at some of them, there's some green, there's some blue, there's some black out there. You have a right to choose what color shoelaces you want. That's not in the Bill of Rights, for crying out loud. But you still have that right. And all of these things, if you tried to list them, absolutely you're going to leave some off. So some are saying you can't, you won't. We'll stumble over it. Sooner or later, there's going to be a big time problem. We still want a Bill of Rights. Yeah, I know, but do you really? No, we want a Bill of Rights. Yeah, but we didn't give enough power to the general government to hurt your rights. No, we still want a Bill of Rights. This is kind of how it went. And we'll see kind of how that ebb and flow went as we go through this with some of the best minds of the patriots of the day. And I spent a little extra time, and I'm not going to apologize because I should have spent more time on a woman that was in the middle of the fray and was one of the anti-federalist writers. She was a brilliant, incredible, eloquent, cogent spokesman for things. And in fact, Alexander Hamilton went to the point, I may mention it again when we get to her. I put her in, and this is really not, you don't need to know all of the bios of the people that were involved, but I thought, people don't even know who she is. In fact, they get her name wrong almost every time when they publish her in some kind of a, what you'll see on one of the slides I've got. They get her name wrong. It's because she never published anything in her own name until 1790. And it's like, wow. Hamilton thought that she was the most brilliant, eloquent person with a pen in the founding era. And Abigail Adams, I think, would have to be in that too. And some of the other women, we just don't have enough information about them. So I thought I'd introduce her a little bit because she was eloquent and powerful in her defense of the need of a Bill of Rights. And I just wish that people spent more time thinking about some of this stuff. Anyway, so there was a big time we were going to fight over this, and maybe we're going to get one or maybe we're not. So we want to know where it came from and how come it's important today, okay? So we need to understand a few things about it. There, at the end of the Constitution Convention, there were three guys. They had sat there through the convention, start to finish, through that long, hot summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, and they refused to sign the Constitution. I mean, it's kind of like, George Washington was the president of the convention. He was president of everything he ever touched. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, here's these three guys. They participated heavily. They weren't just sitting there listening, waiting to hear what came up and then going to go report it back later. No, these guys were in the middle of the fray the whole time. And then at the end, when it comes time to sign, they were not going to sign it. Edmund Randolph, who the heck is he? Well, we don't need to go through all of the bios of these people. We'll be here all night. But these guys were central to the founding of the nation, and they said, we're not going to sign this because it doesn't have a Bill of Rights. And George Washington goes, why didn't you say something during the discussions? Here we have the document in front of us, and we're putting our names on it, and you say you're not going to sign it. What's the deal here? I mean, he didn't berate him. He didn't, he was too much of a gentleman to do that, but his disappointment must have been immense. But here's these three central figures. We're not going to sign it. It doesn't have a Bill of Rights. And it was just shocking to the whole convention, okay? So what happened after the convention, they had their signed document. And you know the backstory probably, that Jefferson and Madison, Jefferson was in France as our ambassador to France, and Madison was in Virginia. They call him the father of the Constitution because he was beating the bushes constantly to get this convention brought together. It wouldn't have happened without James Madison. It wouldn't have happened without George Washington too. And it was a nail biter, cliffhanger, hold your breath kind of thing. Everybody was blue in the face by the time Washington showed up. If Washington had not showed up, the convention would have been a complete belly flop. It would have hurt a bunch because the country would have ended up dying, and England and France and Spain would have divided the colonies up ultimately and picked up the pieces and gone on with their colonies. But so Madison was there. He was so excited they had the convention. He was so happy with the outcome. I mean, there was a lot of things that Madison argued for that got slam dunked down. And he was, no, I'm right. He was a very opinionated guy, and he came to understand, you know, this will work, this thing that we're working on. So he let go of some things a little bit, and other people had to let go of some other things. It was a good blending with, and they talked about later how the finger of God, the hand of God, you know, providence, however they put it, had worked on the group and got it through. And they felt like they could never get anything better, having gone through everything that brought them to that point. Madison forwarded a copy to Thomas Jefferson, who was in Paris as our ambassador. He said, look, we brought out. You know, he folded, I can just see his excitement, folding it up and putting it in the envelope and shipping it off. You know, of course, it didn't go out, you know, express mail or anything. They had to get it over by a boat, you know. And Jefferson got it, and he read it carefully. Now, one class I had in my doctoral courses was to read and then write about the 20 volumes of Jefferson's writings. One class, okay? And there's a whole story about some of the things I went through to be able to get to that point. But what an insight into this brilliant, incisive, eloquent, and powerful mind. And man, it's just something you ought to do. And I'll just say one thing. If you don't do anything else in his writings, get Jefferson and Adams' reconciliation letters. You know, they were best of friends before and up to and through the Declaration. The war went through, and then Adams became vice president, and things started to unravel. And then Jefferson and his Republican ways, and Adams and his Federalist ways, they fell apart. And Jefferson was Adams' vice president. You know, that added to the challenges. At any rate, they just unraveled. But after both of them had served as president, Abigail said to John, again, a brilliant woman, she said, you know, you and Thomas used to be pretty good friends. Why don't you, you know, hit him up, see how things are going? Didn't use those same words, but he wrote to him and he wrote back. And pretty soon there's these reconciliation letters that were just magnificent. Two of the most brilliant minds at the founding era of the United States became best of friends again. And you know, if you remember the history, they both died the same day, July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day of the Declaration being signed. It just happened on happenstance, I'm sure. But at any rate, Jefferson incisively evaluated the Constitution that had been sent to him. He hadn't sat through the convention. And he immediately wrote back to Madison, here's the things I like about your Constitution, but here's some things I don't like. One of the concerns was there was no Bill of Rights. And trial by jury wasn't protected well enough. Well, it's in Article 3 for crying out loud, but nope, it ain't protected well enough. So Jefferson, from his first exposure, was worried about the Constitution. There was some flaws he felt, okay? Well, there were a lot of others that were just absolutely adamant that the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights. So, but those that, as I said, that attended the convention said, no, we didn't give this general government enough power to hurt any of your rights. You can't, you can't list them, that thing we talked about at the very beginning. So we delegated limited powers in the new Constitution, and it wouldn't allow any of our God-given rights to be hurt, okay? Well, they needed some convincing. And I don't want to ask for a show of hands particularly, but there was a series of 85 essays written by these guys, Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and then Hamilton and Madison shared the joint writing of 3 of them. So Hamilton wrote 51. I wish Madison would have written those 51 and his 26, but Hamilton did a pretty decent job, I must say. And by the way, I brought a copy of these Federalist Papers. This is the Gideon edition. Of course, this is a modern printing of it. But as you can see, it's just a little pamphlet. I mean, you know, and yeah, there's 85 articles in here. They were written to be published in the newspapers, okay? And there's I mean, I've got a whole bunch of handwritten notes in this thing. We can tell you how written up my books are when I get done with them. But there's arguments. In fact, Hamilton claimed to have written 63 of them. But Hamilton was an egotistical, kind of arrogant, kind of self-centered kind of guy, you know, and sometimes he blew his own horn a little bit too much. He also wanted our nation to be a monarchy, but that's another story. But Madison wrote that the Gideon edition, the binding of these with the approach that they had in it, was the most correct of the 85 articles. And so from that, and this is my favorite edition. I probably have got 15, you know, Federalist Papers at home or in storage, but you know, I carry little pocket ones that I can take on airplanes so I can read them while I'm flying. At any rate, there were 85 essays written. The intent was to explain and convince the people of the nation that they really did need this Constitution. And so, and by the way, earlier we mentioned this Republic stuff, you know. The very first Federalist paper written by Hamilton, he made a big deal saying that everybody needs to know this is a republic. He says, if you don't know, read these papers. And if you don't know by the end of it, read them again. Because the first Federalist paper and the 85th Federalist paper, that was the central thing they talked about, was this is a republic. And so all through it, like the leaven in the bread, is this concept. It's not always in every article a central theme, but there's enough of this interspersed through all of the articles for people to know this is a republic. And in fact, Hamilton went so far as to say, if you determine it's not a republic, you must defeat this Constitution. That's how serious they were about it. They made this plea throughout all 85 essays. Okay, so just for the fun of it, or I don't know, you might know, Jay became the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after the government was constituted. And you'll see a little bit how we go through that as we explain this. But Jay got sick as he was writing some of these articles, and so he wasn't able to complete his task. And unfortunately, Hamilton doubled what Madison did, but he did a credible job at any rate on this thing. So there was these guys that had been in the convention and were absolutely convinced this was the way to go, that wrote these educational articles, if you will. Well, how come this is not shifting? Interesting. Technology's great when it works. Maybe the battery's probably dead. If anybody's got a couple of AAA batteries, let me know. Anyway, no big deal. I'll let my fingers do the walking on this. You guys probably don't remember the Yellow Pages. Anyway, so there were other adamant. I don't know, for some reason, everything's locked up.
Switch it out.
There we go.
Is that what you're looking for?
I'm looking for a battery that goes in this guy.
You can just borrow this one.
Oh, okay.
Just switch that one out.
I'll do that. Let's see if this puppy works. Okay, thank you. Again, the technologists among us rule nowadays. It is. There's no tyranny here. No, it's not. Let me try this other approach for a second. Here, take that back so I don't steal it. Okay. At any rate, so we came to the point, and we'll repair this later, I guess. But there were some other of these patriots, I said, that we ain't going to do this unless we get some other things in this. So they disagreed. And I say here, see the Anti-Federalist Papers. Well, everybody wrote with a false name. They signed it Publius in the Federalist Papers, so you wouldn't be able to say, oh yeah, Madison wrote that. I agree with him, he's right for sure, or no, I don't agree with Madison. They were not going to have arguments over personalities. The argument could only be among the principles that were put forth. And so the Anti-Federalist Papers, they wrote different names that like one of them, Brutus. Now, what does that tell you about that? They want to go stab Caesar, okay? So anyway, they bought the different names to it. But here's the principal authors, probably of maybe all of them. Anyway, we don't need to talk about every one of them individually. But you see that woman in the top center, basically. Her name is Mercy Owen Warren, according to a lot of the paperwork that's out there. But her real name was Mercy Otis Warren. And again, after her death, only was when some of this was discovered that she had been the author of it. Again, an amazing woman. And so I just thought I'd throw a little information in there. Again, it's not pertinent particularly to how the Bill of Rights came about, but she was a poetess and she attacked with plays the royalty in Massachusetts. This is when the Revolution had not happened yet. And so, you speak against the king, you had to be pretty clever about it and not be somehow put into chains, of course. She wanted to have people resist what the Brits were doing to us here in this land, that we were free, subject to the king, English subjects, free men, as Blackstone said, and these are the rights of free men. And she was standing for those things. During the Revolution, she was a poet, still a playwright, and a pamphleteer. What does that mean? She wrote a lot of the things. You've heard of like Common Sense, for example, that Thomas Paine wrote. And that's the kind of stuff she was putting out. Again, she did not publish any of these things in her name until after 1790. So after the Revolution, she wrote this one, which basically became one of the Anti-Federalist Papers, Observations on the New Constitution and on the state and federal and state conventions. And in that, she strongly made the case against the Constitution being ratified until and unless it got a Bill of Rights. And she also, and I'll show you the title page of her 3-volume, this is volume 1 in the next slide, and a 3-volume series, a pretty good sized set of writings about the history of the rise, progress, and termination of the American Revolution. And then she authored some poems and plays in her own name after 1790. And then later on, they discovered, oh my goodness, she was one of the Anti-Federalists. And her son brought that out and found some of her writings. So she was married to James Warren, and he was also involved in the independence movement. They were equally yoked in the cause of liberty. And I will just say, and I started to make a slide with the prominent people that she was not only well known to, but interacted constantly with. Her letters are amazing with these people. And I started to make, and I'm going, who am I going to leave off of the principal founders? Because she was engaged with the men and the women, and she had her say, and was very eloquent and very, very well thought out. So I didn't put it in anyway, because it was like, okay, we'd have to go through and decide who we were leaving off the list. But she really was a central figure in all of this. And Hamilton spoke very highly of her and her ability to communicate the ideas of liberty. So her and her husband, heavily engaged, and family members, they were just they were a patriotic family. So here's the title page of her first volume of the 3-volume history. And if you can get it and read it, I think it's an enlightening experience to be able to do that. But in these anti-federalist papers, basically, they had a central theme. I mean, there's a lot of things they're complaining about. And a lot of them I go, you didn't read Federalist 10, or you forgot to read, and the Federalist paper that I go back to and say, didn't you read that when they published that? Because it was published before. I mean, I'm just kind of critical that they weren't reading for understanding. And so some of the Federalist papers, it was kind of like you get in these arguments on social media, and some of these people want to argue something that was answered, 27 lines ago. and it's just, oh, you guys, you just drive me nuts. But that's kind of what happened in some of them. But one of the central themes was no Bill of Rights, no Constitution. We're not going to do it. And so this became a really big problem. And it came to be basically that they weren't going to get a ratification. It wasn't going to happen without a Bill of Rights. And there was a big movement to have another convention. And there was actually, after they had all of the ratifications necessary for it to be into effect and it had started to be implemented, there was a letter that came to James Madison requesting that another convention be called. And I've got a copy of Madison's response. But the fact of the matter is, he says, no, it's just too risky. We're going to have a problem. But they wanted to call another convention. I mean, there were some people that would take this to the mat. They were not going to have a constitution if they didn't get a Bill of Rights. So what these founding father guys did, these principal guys that were there said, okay, we get it. We understand. Okay, if you will ratify the Constitution as written, we promise you our first principal focus will be to produce a Bill of Rights, and we'll get it out to the states for ratification using the amendment process found in Article 5. So that was going to be their first order of business to write a Bill of Rights if they could get a ratification. The other guy said, you know what, you're honorable individuals, we're going to trust you on this. Now, you can't see that happening probably now, but in those days there was a measure of honor and respect and belief. So anyway, once they did, they'd take this first order of business and prepare and propose a Bill of Rights and then give it to the states. Now, what would have to happen was that 2/3 of all of the House and Senate would have to say, we agree that these are proposed Bill of Rights that we're suggesting be ratified. And then the 3/4 of the states had to ratify them before they became the Bill of Rights and were changed in the Constitution. So the states, with that commitment, went forward, and by the middle of the summer in 1788, they had ratified it with adequate number of states to be able to implement it. Now, you need to understand, I'll just remind you, I'm sure most of you probably already know this, but the original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, required all states to ratify any changes. That's a pretty high bar. I mean, Rhode Island didn't even attend the convention on the Constitution. So getting their approval was going to be a pretty steep ladder to climb. And so, but they said, no, really, that's one of the big flaws of the existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, along with stuff like term limits. They had term limits in there. They found they were a failure formula and that they were destroying the nation. And some of the other things that required the state's involvement in that shouldn't have been involved in a national government situation. And we could talk about how most of the people that are suggesting a Constitution Convention be called again want to revert back to many of the things that were in the original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And again, they had it in front of them when they wrote their Constitution in the summer of 1787, and they left those things out on purpose. They hadn't worked. So one of the things they changed was the ratification process. And again, I'll just revert back to what some of the Constitution Convention people say, that we got to get 3/4 of the states to agree to any changes proposed. And so, Bradley, you're just, you're sweating bullets over nothing. Quit worrying. And nobody's going to say 3/4 of the states are going to make a bad decision and take a tumble on this. Well, there's probably some of you that remember the 16th Amendment, which is what they blame income tax on, or the 17th Amendment, where the states lost their seat at the national level, where the Senate was now directly elected by the people, so they're glorified members of the House. They get their power from the people, not the states. Or you can remember the 18th Amendment, prohibition. Just some of these little things that have happened, or the 14th Amendment, which was 1868, and the shenanigans that were pulled to get that thing ratified. If they get something out there and they want it ratified, it's going to, in fact, 14th Amendment, I'm going to offer, not really suggest, but sometime if you're interested, we'll do a review of the 14th Amendment and how it came to be. It was bold-faced, bare-naked tyranny put forth by radical Republicans in the House and the Senate, and how they got that ratified by hook and by crook, and it was by crook. So I'll suggest that, and at some point, if there's a request, we could do a presentation on that as part of the flawed process that has been followed for some amendments. So at any rate, by midsummer of 1788, there were adequate number of states that had ratified it, that now they could begin the implementation of the process. In spite of that, and they had two major states, the big states that were so powerful, New York and Virginia, that they were holding out saying, if we can get those guys on board, this will be a success. So it went a little bit after the midsummer, even though they had adequate numbers for ratification. So it was deemed ratified. They did get Virginia and New York in too, by very small minorities. It was a nip and tuck, by the skin of your teeth kind of ratification in some instances. If there'd been a vote or two changed, we wouldn't have got the ratification. It was very interesting. So once they got the ratification process, they began to do what was necessary to begin the new government. Now, the thing that's interesting, and I kind of put this in this little next few slides, because everything's kind of on autopilot. We just had an election, and we think, always been this way, always will be, blah, blah, blah. And there was steps they had to go through. And it was a very well-defined and executed process. You didn't just wave your magic wand and all of a sudden the general government's in place. Now, if you thought about it for more than a nanosecond, you'd go, yeah, we understand that. But things had to happen in a sequence. And in a minute, I'm going to show you that George Washington was elected by the Electoral College on the 6th of April, 1789. And he was informed on the 14th of April, 1789. He sent a letter back accepting, and he was inaugurated the 30th of April, 1789. Well, his vice president, John Adams, was inaugurated the 21st of April. Huh? President isn't even in there. What are we talking about here? How'd that happen? Well, the Senate needed a president for them to have a quorum and do their business. And so John Adams was inaugurated, almost 2 weeks, not quite, 9 days, before George Washington was inaugurated. These kind of things happened so they could have a quorum in the Senate and they could do their meetings and begin their processes too. So there was there was some delays that had to happen in order to be able to pull this off. So they started this new thing, and the elections were held to create the legislative branch. And they were sworn into office. Now later on, right soon after everybody got operational, they created the actual oath of office for them, but before that it was a very simple oath. So, they had to kind of, feel their way and improvise a little bit too to get there. So they held the elections for the legislative. They were sworn into office, and then the electors were selected out of the states. And it was a constitutional process. We could read it over if you wanted to find out how the electors were selected. Far different than what we do today. And nowadays, the parties select their own electors normally within the state. And so let's just take the state of Utah where we are. If you go to the Republican convention, the year of the election, there are people that are running to be electors for the president. And so you vote in the convention as to who you're going to select to be your electors. And so the Constitution Party in Utah has 6 electors. Democrats have 6 electors. Republicans have 6 electors, and so on. And so whichever presidential candidate that gets the majority of the votes in Utah, let's say it's a Republican, just happenstantially, and so he gets the majority of the votes, and so the Republican Party sends their 6 electors to do their job. So this is how almost all states do it. There are a couple of states that have, it's a winner take all in the state of Utah. In virtually all states, there's 2 states that they kind of split it up so that you can, it is not a winner take all based upon the count. And by the way, the electors are designated based upon how many representatives in Congress the state has, plus their 2 senators. So Utah has 4 representatives and 2 senators. They get 6 votes. Okay. California has 52 representatives and 2 senators. So they get 54 votes. Okay. So that's how it works. It's a mix of the states as a political entity and the population. We could talk about why we don't want to change that. And Colorado found out just why this year too, by the way. Just as a little note, they passed and their governor signed a winner take all for the whole nation. It's a process for a national popular vote, they call it. And under that process, and Utah has had Republican legislators that have fostered this for Utah, and it's a big, 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 big mistake. We can talk about it in more detail if you wish. But what this basically says, if the national popular vote goes to, candidate Harris, then all of our votes in the Electoral College go to candidate Harris. Okay? Now, can you see a flaw in this? Okay. You're smarter than a lot of legislators. At any rate, I'll just tell you how this went. Nevada passed it, a Democratic legislature with a Democratic governor. The Democrat legislature passed it, and the governor says, the heck you say. Nevada won't even be on the agenda for presidential candidates in the future, because if the popular vote goes with one candidate or the other, all of Nevada's votes will go to or all of Nevada's electoral votes will go for that. It's called the national popular vote. So he vetoed it. Okay. Now I think they've since passed it again, but that's just a story where you had a governor smarter than the legislators. But in Colorado, they passed this national popular vote thing, and the governor signed it, and presto changeo, guess what happened? They voted Democrat, and Trump, Republican, got the national popular vote. And so they had a little safety valve in there that said, well, if there haven't been enough states approve this that we can change the election, we don't have to send ours. So right now they didn't send them. But you get the idea. See, for the last 20 years, the popular vote has been won by Democrats, and this year, a Republican won the popular vote. And so you can see how these things, good for the goose, good for the gander kind of thing, you see it's a stupid, stupid thing. But anyway, that happened in Colorado. So I just explained how the electors are selected, and the states have that responsibility and that power to do that. Okay, and that I explained how Utah does that at this time. So they got electors for president. I wished I could in detail, but this isn't the purpose of this get-together tonight, go over why an electoral college was chosen to be the way to do it. And you can read Federalist 68, if you want to go back and take a look at that. Hamilton wrote that again, and again he did a pretty good job. And in it he said, guess what? All of the things you're beefing about in the Constitution and every argument you've got, this is the only principle nobody disagrees with. He said basically everybody that has had anything to say about this agrees the Electoral College is a good approach. But we're not going to go into detail as to why it was a good approach, but it is a magnificent approach to avoid controversy, to prevent the things of party, which we've encouraged by putting it in the hands of the parties to handle this. And it's been a travesty of how we've changed it. But the idea was to get a president of the United States, not a president of party or a president of a region or a president from the state. It was to be somebody that avoided the acrimony and everything that we've seen develop in modern election processes because we've screwed up what they did originally. There were billions of dollars spent in this election process. It's a beauty contest that is based upon controversy and collecting money. This took all of that out of it. Representatives in each state that were trusted representatives that could look at the qualifications, the character, the principles of all the individuals and then cast their vote. And it really was a good process and resulted in George Washington being elected unanimously both times that he was elected president. Okay, so I should be drinking water or something, whatever's in this. I'm kidding you. You know that it's a fruit drink. When I was a little boy, now I'm off on another tangent, and I got a cough, my grandma would produce my grandma would produce a very effective cough syrup that I loved. Just warmed all the way down. My cough was soothed. And she made it out of whiskey, honey, lemon, and butter, all warmed together. Some of you may recognize that as a hot toddy. But she'd give me 2 tablespoons of it, and I'd go off merrily on my way, and I'd come back in a little while and say, I need some more of that stuff, you know. That's not what this is, by the way. So just so you understand, some of the old remedies really did work. At any rate, this is going back to the baseline principles of this nation. So anyway, we got electors. They were done right initially. We've screwed it up royally ever since. But there's a real effort to get rid of the Electoral College, and they're going to try and initially run it through with the national popular vote thing, which I just explained how good that worked out for Colorado this time around. So the electors on April 6th, because there was some delays right after in being able to count the electoral votes, they elected on April 6th George Washington to be the first president. Okay, then on April 14th, a guy named Charles Thomas, who was the Secretary of the Continental Congress, and he'd held the job, and there's a whole story about how he ended up kind of being pushed aside, and they got a new president of the, not a president of the Senate, but a Secretary of the Senate. And all this came together about the election, but Thomas was chosen to deliver a letter to George Washington at Mount Vernon to tell him, you're the man, okay? So, by the way, no campaigning on George Washington's part. He went home and he was tending his farm, and he got informed, probably in his living room, maybe out in the field, I don't know where he actually got delivered it. But the letter said that the Electoral College has selected you to be the president. George Washington, just as a little side note, magnificent individual. He never sought for power. He sought to pull it down. He didn't seek to aggrandize his name. He tried to deflect. I've got his letters about when they tried to make him, you know, the commander-in-chief of the army in the Revolutionary War. I've got his private letters to his wife about it. This was not some affected, hey, I'm going to tell everybody in the room that I don't think I'm worthy, but by damn, you know I am, kind of thing, you know. I mean, there was none of that. None of that. He was completely self-effacing. And he, to his wife, he called her Patsy in his letters. to his wife, he just kind of was a sob in his heart. I'm not worthy of this, and I can't do it. I mean, this was just the way the man was. And he led the armies, and then you've heard of his stuff at when they were trying to do the revolt and how he got that stopped. And when the war was over and he waited for the Brits to pull out of New York, he rode down and delivered his commission to the Congress, and he went home to be a farmer. He was done. Then he got called in this nonsense called a convention, and he didn't want to go. He's reluctant. I think I've got three letters where he declined the appointment to go to the convention. It's like, no, he was serious. It wasn't, well, you can ask me again and I'll go, but you know what? I just got to have this on file. No. He definitely didn't feel like he was the man. He was the man of the hour. He did not want to feel that way about himself. He did not seek for the power. Anyway, finally they prevailed on him to go to the convention. Without him being there, it would have failed miserably. He was the guy everybody trusted. He was going to be no tyrant ever. And if he was there, the people knew he was watching out for what needed to be watched out for. Anyway, so when he got done with the convention, he went home to be a farmer again. You know, he'd spend another whole summer away from his farm, and then they'd come up with this harebrained idea of making him president. You know, and it was like he wasn't seeing it. But he was very, very cordial. He was very diplomatic. He was kind. He was gentlemanly, all that. And so he gets this letter, and he probably thought in his mind, oh man, okay, I'm going to have to do this. So duty called again, and he immediately responded with an acceptance letter, send it back. Okay. Now, 2 days later, he set out to New York City, where they were going to have the little get-together and inaugurate him. He was accompanied by a guy named David Humphreys, and this Charles Thompson, that was the guy that delivered him the letters, traveled with him. Okay, so as they came from his home in Virginia to New York, they went through all the little towns and villages on the way, and he kept getting delayed. Everybody was greeting him as the conquering hero and the man of the hour and everything else like that, and he was very gracious about that. But he got delayed, and it took him until about the last week in April to finally get to New York. I mean, they had armadas when he was on boat that accompanied him, everything like that. So finally he gets through all of this stuff, and by April 30th, he was inaugurated, and the framework of the new Constitution was in place. They had the legislature, they had the executive, and they were going to have to appoint the judicial after that. But these things were the initial things that they need to get the oath of office and a lot of other things, along with coming up with a proposed Bill of Rights. So on April 30th, in this balcony in New York City, he took the oath of office, which is specifically defined in Article 2 of the Constitution. So they had a predefined oath of office for the president. Then the legislature said, okay, we told you guys that our first order of business, which is going to take a while, they can't do it in one day, realistically. We will put our hearts to put forth a Bill of Rights for you. And so they said, send in your suggestions. Okay, 189 suggestions were sent in. Oh boy, what do we do? That people were saying, well, the right to keep and bear arms, or you know, we need to keep our guns, or we need to worship the God of our choice, or freedom of religion, or whatever. There were nuanced things, but some of them were very closely related in terms of what they were trying to accomplish. So what they did is they examined each of these proposed Bill of Rights, and they eliminated the ones that were just replications, or they took the best wording or whatever and put them into the proposed. And so they suggested them and winnowed them down to 17 proposed amendments. Okay, and so you get the idea from that the people had a pretty good idea what they wanted, and they replicated many of them in their suggested wording and so on and so forth. But they got them down to 17 proposed amendments out of those 189. So the Congress then reviewed those 17 amendments very carefully, chewed them up, spit them out, and reviewed them again. And they got rid of 5 of them. So they were down to 12. And this is one that I wanted to kind of focus on a little bit as an example that was rejected. Now, think about this as I read it, and then we're going to read it again in a moment or two. But here's the one. This is one they threw out. It's what? What the heck? No state shall violate the equal rights of conscience or the freedom of the press or the trial by jury in criminal cases. Who could be against that? I mean, you don't want to have any your conscience, your freedom of the press, or trial by. You don't want any of that violated, do you? I mean, I certainly don't. But there's some very good logic behind this. We'll see in just a moment. Okay, they sound like good things, don't they? Well, read it again. No state shall violate the equal rights of conscience or the freedom of the press or the trial by jury in criminal cases. And the question again, who would be against that and why? The problem is that this amendment in the federal Constitution would place the federal government in a superior position in all of those things. Anything that had anything to do with any of those things, did I say any, would be cause for potentially appealing this to the general government. Now, if you carefully read the Constitution, you'll find that there are very, very, very few criminal activities that are delegated for the general government to be involved in. I mean, it's like, okay, let's just take Joe Biden and Orrin Hatch. Back in the 1990s, they wrote the Violence Against Women's Act. Well, who would say violence against women is a good thing? Oh, well, some people probably would. But the fact of the matter, any decent person would say, yeah, we can't have that happening. It's the wrong thing. This was written, by the way, at the same time that Joe Biden was assaulting his staffer in the hallways of the Senate building. You probably heard about that story. But at any rate, so the Violence Against Women's Act was proposed and passed by Orrin Hatch. They co-sponsored it, and Joe Biden. As bad as violence against women is, it's not a federal offense. It doesn't make it more serious to make it a federal offense. It is simply left in the hands of the states. And so what has been happening is that the federal government, and I just use that as an example, has been usurping chunk after chunk after chunk. And a guy that we've talked about before, if you've been around, name of St. George Tucker, talked about how everything except for the few enumerated in the Constitution that were criminal acts were left in the hands of the states. Okay? And murder's a horrible thing. It's not a federal offense. You know, I mean, this thing that kidnapping, it's not a federal offense. It's just not. It's not in the federal Constitution. And so they were very careful to say these things and these things only are criminal offenses that belong in the federal courts. Okay? And so this thing that we read in this proposed amendment would say anytime the things that are mentioned there, like conscience or press, if you were in your state court and you got convicted and almost anything, you could say, well, my freedom of conscience was violated. Oh, okay, it's a federal case, we send it to the federal judges. The states would have been in an inferior position in almost anything that came up. And so they eliminated it because the general government would be given oversight of almost any conceivable matter with that particular amendment. And so they rejected it. They had the foresight to say, no, you can't go to the federal court every time you don't get the outcome you wanted, and you can somehow hold your mouth just the right way to see that your freedom of conscience was violated, okay? And now the federal judges have got to take this, go and so on. So almost every action could be construed to somehow fall under that category. So they threw that out and kept it from being appealed to the federal government. Okay, if their state had done it, okay, now there's no limit to things that could almost be twisted into doing that. And so they said, no, the federal government is not going to have oversight power in these kind of things. Freedom of the press, brought into question anything appealed and adjudicated by the federal government. Or how the trial by jury, in virtually every single criminal case, could be opened up to federal review. Every single one of those instances mentioned in that proposed amendment would make almost every case that came through the courts an appealable thing to the federal courts. You're saying, no, wait a minute. We're doing that right now. Aren't we doing that? Yeah, we're kind of doing it. Aren't we doing that? I'm going to also suggest that if you're interested and express that to me, I would be willing to do a review of the 14th Amendment, which very, very closely resembles what this other one would do, and will use as the basis of that review something that the Utah Supreme Court reviewed in 1968. So, which was 100 years from the 14th Amendment, under the Radical Republicans, was brought forth in 1868. The Utah Supreme Court did a review that was incisively blistering of what the 14th Amendment brought around. And if you're interested, that 14th Amendment thing I think would be interesting to us for a lot of reasons. First, how federal has usurped things. Second, how it has destroyed our immigration policy, and it just is absolutely devastating to the sovereignty of the states in their realm. Okay, so the federal government guys in the founding era in 1789 saw through that and said, we're not going to let that proposed amendment go through because it's overarching everything else. And they rejected it because it would have given the national government expansive powers. So I give you the example at the bottom of this slide to see the 14th Amendment, and I'll suggest it again in a moment, that the 14th Amendment is an excellent example of a bad example and how this thing came about. And it is being used today in the nation to destroy almost every aspect of everything that keeps this separation of powers and delegated authority from being merged together under the power, centralized under the general government. So I would say at some point, if you're interested, I would be willing to review the 14th Amendment in comparison with this amendment that was rejected in 1789, because it was wisely rejected, and then the radical Republicans of 1868 passed it by hook and crook, and literally you'll find it was not just a travesty, it was absolute tyranny that was implemented with the absolute intent I say it was written with venom, and it was to poison much of the nation. So we can look at that at some point if you want to. But we will look at this point of the wise words of James Madison in the 45th Federalist paper. He said, and by the way, the reason the last 2.5 lines, or maybe if you put them together, 2 lines, are bolded, is because you've heard of a guy that's just been elected and is now the president-elect that wants to run things on tariffs. And that would be the principal form of taxation. Well, that was the original intent of the American Founding Fathers as expressed in Federalist 45 by James Madison. That isn't the topic we're discussing particularly this evening, but it shows up in writing. Go read the Federalist 45. Madison said, yeah, we're going to do all these things that the responsibilities of the general government by using our imports and taxes that come on duties that come into the country. Okay, so here's what he says in Federalist 45. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. How about that, sports fines? Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And we'll talk about how they're not innumerable. They're not all-encompassing. Someday when we get a chance, we'll talk about that. But he basically says the general government has these few powers. State governments have got a lot more authority than they. The former, meaning back in the general government, the national government, will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last, meaning foreign commerce, the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. Isn't that interesting? Now, I've seen people that purport to be constitutionally sound-minded people. They probably have never read the Federalist Papers or the Farewell Address or anything like that, but they don't believe that any taxes should be. And I'm for that, but you don't have a government. How are we going to fulfill the duties delegated to the general government if you don't have a way of paying for them? I'm sure we're going to have a military force that out of the goodness of their heart and their devotion to the country are going to serve without pay. See how that works. Now, when I was in and I had 2 stripes on my arm, I was making $100 a month. Now, they're making a lot more than that now. Some of you wonder how you'd work on $100 a day. I am right now. But at any rate, the point of the matter is that there are things that have got to be paid for if you're going to fulfill the responsibilities that are delegated within the Constitution of the general government. And so these people that say, oh no, we don't have to run it with the taxes, we can print money. That'll work pretty good. Anyway, we do way too much of that stuff by printing money now, as you well know, that will never be paid back by the youngest in here's great-grandchildren at the rate we're going. Okay, so few powers to the general government, more expansive powers to the state government. Our taxing power was intended to be principally involved with importing, okay? Going on. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. So he's saying here, oh, what do you mean? Lives, liberties, properties of the people. So the general government's not supposed to have any messing around with that at all, are they? That's the intent originally from the founding fathers. So we can see that this amendment that was proposed as part of the ones that made it to the 17 final ones was rejected because it could have been perversely applied to some ill-conceived amendments like this 14th Amendment we've mentioned a time or two, which absolutely was tyranny from the get-go. And they knew it and they were going to get it regardless of what anybody said. Which again brings me back to those that want to do a Constitution Convention and get people to say, oh, well, it'll never be ratified if there's a wrong proposed change. Well, I mentioned some that got approved by 3/4 of the states, at least. They claim they did anyway. We could discuss how the 16th Amendment was and the 17th Amendment and the 18th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, obviously, and they did that by kicking states out of the nation if their vote wasn't right. The Congress said, no, you guys, we're not going to call you states right now. And they did it by whatever it took to have happen. It's just criminal. So right now, the federal government's engaged in overreach, centralizing all power in Washington. And that's a bad thing. And they're centralizing it not just in Washington, and I'll show you a slide in just a second what Jefferson said, but Madison said if you combine the judicial, executive, and legislative authorities, see, legislative makes the law, the executive executes the law, and the judicial gets in and gets involved when there's disagreement about those things, okay? If you put them all in under one head, whether they're elected or appointed or anything, it's the very definition of tyranny, according to James Madison. But this idea of centralizing power in Washington was addressed by Thomas Jefferson, where he said, when all government, domestic and foreign, in little as in great things, shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another, and will become as venal and oppressive as the government from which we separated. So it's going to destroy our nation. And so this idea of centralizing power, like this amendment of 1789, proposed amendment would have done, or the 14th Amendment, or any of the executive orders, or any of the falsely passed rules, regulations, and laws that the general government, like the Violence Against Women Act that Hatch and Biden put out together, these things are centralizing things in the hands of the general government that should not be. So, the founding fathers were determined to keep the national government constrained to the few and defined powers enumerated in the national contract, United States Constitution. Okay, so they didn't want to leave any wiggle room that they could kind of grab a little here and grab a little there until now almost everything's a federal offense. I was cross-country skiing in the canyon here some time ago. And I went past a sign, and it had all these rules in the forest that it was in, and it had a little thing at the bottom that said it's a federal offense to deface this sign. And as I went past, I muttered under my breath, what isn't? I mean, you know, it's like everything is a federal offense now. We've made it so that there's a general usurpation of all powers in the national government. So let's talk about what George Washington said in his farewell address. He said this: if the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be any particular wrong, as you see it's underlined, italicized, and bolded, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. That's what they were doing with the proposed Bill of Rights. It was short on that thing. But let there be no change by usurpation, which is how they do it all today. For though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So if you look at any incoming president-elect, I don't know who I might be talking about, starts proposing things as a way to solve our problems, and they're extra-constitutional, they're not within the powers of the president or the legislature or any of these things, we've got to be careful. Usurpation, you say, well, by golly, we need this to happen. But if it does, somewhere down the line, we're going to pay the price. And we're going to find that where some people thought it was a great idea, I'll just use an example of, some of you may have heard the case of the Brunson brothers to the Supreme Court about the 2020 election, and how they want to have the Supreme Court disenfranchise, if you will, or dissolve the legislative branch of the government. Huh? The Supreme Court can do this? Wait a minute, where's my Constitution? No. And no, if people have to do that, they're really in trouble. They're separate and equal, powerful branches. And 5 members of the Supreme Court cannot dissolve the legislative branch and the executive branch, which was what this Supreme Court case was intended to do. If they did, we would have an oligarchy of 5 judges running this country. They can't say the legislative doesn't matter anymore because we ruled, or the executive branch. They were going to get rid of, I think, 388 members of the legislature and the president, vice president, some other executive branch members. Gone. Just gone. It can't happen. If that could happen, guess what might happen this time? If somebody of similar ilk took something to the Supreme Court and said, if they ratify wrongly the Trump election, the legislature needs to be dissolved and so does the executive branch. How does that shoe fit now? This is something that cannot, must not, and should never be considered should happen. And yet this week, I saw them attempting to run that through the Supreme Court again. Okay, so you can't overthrow the government using the branches of the government. It's a coup. And let there be no change by usurpation, for though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So if it could have been done because the outcome of the election in 2020 was not acceptable, it could be done because the election in 2024 was not acceptable to some people. And you cannot run a country that way. Okay, so we have unending usurpations. We're on thin ice in today's political world. So, with a wise original intent, on September 26, 1789, Congress passed 12 amendments by the 2/3 vote and forwarded them to the states for ratification. There were 12 amendments they sent a preamble with, though. Most people, many people, you all may know, there was a Bill of Rights preamble that basically said, here's why we're doing this. So here's what the preamble says in the Bill of Rights. It's not the in order to form a more perfect union preamble we know from the beginning of the Constitution. This is in the beginning of the Bill of Rights. The conventions of a number of the states having at the time of adopting the Constitution expressed a desire in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added. Remember that. To prevent misconstruction or abuse, they wanted to declare more clearly and put restrictive clauses in there, okay? And as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institution. So, they were intending with these Bill of Rights to prevent the general government from overstepping the bounds established in the Constitution and preventing some misconstruction or abuse of its powers. Okay, so they were declaratory restrictive clauses that were to clarify limits and bounds of the general governments. They were not constraints upon the people or the states, but constraints upon the national government. Okay, do you understand that? Okay, so let me just give you an example of something that they had in mind. Some of you may have heard of the Second Amendment, okay? You know, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's a pretty straightforward portion, you know. And we can discuss and understand that the militia talked about was everybody. I mean, that's the way it was defined by the men that wrote this Second Amendment. It wasn't a National Guard. That wasn't even created until like 1903 or 4 with the Dick Act. National Guard didn't exist. And the Founding Fathers, George Mason said, who are the militia? They're everybody, except for a few elected officials. And he didn't define them well, but I don't want to be those that are left out. So, I was in a debate one time between candidates when I was running for Senate the second time. And it was a very interesting debate process. And without going through the whole process and boring you to death on it, basically each candidate got a question, had 2 minutes to answer it, and then all the other candidates got 1 minute to rebut it, and then the one that had been asked the question got a minute to rebut that. Okay, so it was a very long process. There were 11 of us in the room, with virtually all of the Utah County Republican convention delegates there. I mean, well, it wasn't in one room. They were multiple rooms at UVU. And so there was a board that asked the questions. And everybody got their 2 minutes, then 1 minute, then 1 minute. Then the next guy got 2 minutes, 1 minute, 1 minute. Okay, you get an idea. A round robin that was very time consuming. Happened to be that I was the last candidate to get asked a question. Everybody was antsy to go and everything like this. And here's this one idiot there that still got to answer one more question. And so I'm going, give me my question. You know, and I was kind of jumping at the bit. And they said, your question is, did the Constitution create a right for all to have arms? And I took a deep breath and I looked at everybody, a little pregnant pause there, you know. And I said, no. I mean, the pitchforks were being sharpened, the torches were being lit, and everybody was ready to take me out, string me up, and run me out of town. I said, yeah. I mean, there was a roar out of the audience, literally. And it's like, the heck you say? And so I said, just a minute. I'm not done with my answer. I got 2 minutes here. And so I explained to them that no, it did not create that right. That is a God-given right. It predates all kings, presidents, potentates, congresses, parliaments, constitutions, or any other form of government. It came by nature of the fact God gave it to us. The group settled down pretty quickly, okay? But the point of the matter is that they recognized in this Bill of Rights God-given rights. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed, created equal. What does that suppose? Oh, a creator. They're endowed by their creator. Oh, what's a creator? Oh, it's the guy that created you. Okay. Certain inalienable rights. Unarguably, these are our rights. Mentions a few, and then it says it's the purpose of government to secure those rights. Government's principal purpose is to secure our God-given rights. And so the Declaration of Independence tells us this in plain English. English words who can be defined, and they can only be defined in the definitions of the day. They can't mean anything else. And we can know these things. And so when these Bill of Rights were brought forth, it was a reiteration that these things are all, we're going to protect everything God gave us. And so, my answer was no, the Second Amendment didn't create that right. We had it before the Second Amendment. Canonized it, recognized it, and made it pretty important because we're not supposed to be able to violate it. Isn't it important that that's in there? Because now we've got over 25,000 laws in this nation. The people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Oh, that's it? 25,000 laws that infringe the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Some states are more egregious than others. But the point of the matter is it was a recognized God-given right. That's how it got in there. This freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of redress of grievances, assembly, all of those kind of things. Yeah, in the First Amendment, just there, we got 5 of them. How about that, sports fans? And it goes through the Bill of Rights that way. And they're just a reiteration of what was clearly understood. And if you look at the Third Amendment, for example, and I used to always say, the Third Amendment's probably the only one we're not violating constantly. I don't say that anymore. Well, I just said it, but I don't mean it because we now have embedded within our communities a federally purchased law enforcement agency that basically they bought the police force. You guys need money for armor? You guys need money for firearms or ammunition or for more vehicles? Or pick something. Write a grant and we'll send you money. Who just got bought? Okay? And that's how it's happening. We're embedding within our own communities a federal military, for example. This idea that President-elect Trump just came up to and about distributing at least 100,000, 110,000 federal jobs to the communities. Well, first of all, you look at that. Right now they're contained in what should be, 64,000 acres in Washington, D.C. Now you're going to put them in Logan, Utah, and in Springville, and in, you pick a city that, maybe near you. Now you're going to put them in there. You're going to have to rent facilities and staff the facilities, and you're going to have all of the infrastructure necessary for that. The whole 9 yards. So the expense is going to go through the ceiling. But now we have an IRS positioned on every street corner, if you will. And I'm just saying, just think about this stuff before you get too excited about it. I shouldn't ask for a show of hands, but probably some of you have been in Washington, D.C. It's a militarized city. Body armor on every corner. Doesn't it have that? M16s across their chest. I've tried going there and talking to the guys. I don't know if they speak Russian or Chinese or what, but they won't talk to me normally. If I get a group of them together, they maybe feel a little more comfortable because some of my words won't hurt them all at once. But it's just astounding to me. We have a militarized city in the United States. You say, well, we got to protect against bad guys. Anyway, what if this all got distributed all across the United States? What if it was in your hometown? I don't know. It doesn't sound like a good idea. It sounds like a violation of the Third Amendment to me, ultimately and finally. The Fourth Amendment happened because they were able to go and have writs of assistance, where they could have a blank piece of paper and says, I, and a blank for the officer of the king, am hereby authorized to search, blah, blah, blah. Oh, it's a blank. You put it in. And search for any contraband that might be found therein or whatever. There were blank search warrants. And the people said, no, we ain't going to do this no more. We were offended by that when the king's officers did that, and we're going to stop that, and you've got to have specificity, and it's got to be a sworn thing. The officer does this. And I wish there were time to go through and review with you the egregious violations that are currently occurring. And the Patriot Act basically did away with the Fourth Amendment. I'm probably one of the few people in the whole world that's read the Patriot Act cover to cover, top to bottom, highlighted, annotated, cross-referenced it all, okay? And here's something I didn't do, because I was doing all this manually. I found 214 other sections of U.S. law that were affected by the Patriot Act that were just mentioned by reference. I didn't have a chance to go through all the 214 others. So this thing is quite encompassing. Orrin Hatch, in his last campaign in 2012, said he was the principal author. Now, I doubt that very much. I don't think he had the brain cells to create that, but I think he encouraged it. Well, of course, his handlers made sure he had a pretty good copy before. Anyway, point of the matter is, we are just eviscerating these things. And these were there as constraints on the national government for no other purpose. They weren't there to constrain you, they were to constrain them from taking certain actions. And so these things have been turned on their head. Jefferson, in his Kentucky Resolution, said, "Let no more be said of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution." Well, Constitution is just made out of parchment. You know, you could wrap it around your arms and legs and you're gone. It's done. But everybody, from the legislature to keep the president constrained, and the House to keep the Senate constrained, and us to keep them constrained, it's a multi-level kind of thing. We've got to understand it. If we do not, we cannot. That's a major problem. But we got to bind people down with the chains of the Constitution. The rights were not created by the Bill of Rights. They pre-existed everybody that's gone before, anywhere, at any time, and they were a part of our inalienable rights with which God has endowed all mankind. So I didn't get strung up during that debate in UVU. And in fact, I wasn't even a Republican, and I was in the debate. It was a little bit of a miracle. They had a vote afterwards, and I came in second place. They never knew me. But at any rate, people, it resonates with people if you can explain it to them. Okay, then we come to that problem. It's impossible to enumerate all of our rights. We talked about the shoelace thing, didn't we? I don't have any. You do, you do. You don't. No. Yeah. Okay. They were concerned if you leave a right off, I mean, speech and press and religion, and I mean, we go through number one, arms and this, and you try and go through all of those and you say, what did we leave off? Well, what did we leave off? You can choose how many children you want, what color roof you're going to have in some communities, whether it's a chain link fence or a picket fence. I mean, you can choose so many innumerable things. Do you want to use number 6 bird shot when you're hunting pheasants, or 7.5? I mean, pick anything you're talking about. Okay? So you can't. You just can't list them. So they wanted to make sure they had an all-encompassing process by which they could protect those. And so they wrote the 9th Amendment. And someday, if you want me to, we'll go through each of the amendments, in sequence. And I don't know if you want to do the first 10 amendments and then the rest of those that are probably going to break something someday if they haven't already, or what. So there's some offers that I've thrown out on the table, and we don't have to do anything if you don't want to. But if they didn't mention a right, it would still remain. And this is what they said. The enumeration, so that's the listing or numbering, in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So if we listed it or we didn't list it, you still got it. Okay? So that way, they were absolutely certain that the national government could never assume or usurp these additional undelegated powers. Because it's all encompassing. Listed or not, you still got them. Okay? And then the 10th Amendment put a period and exclamation point above the whole thing that said, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So what that says, if we didn't delegate it to you, you ain't got it. In the modern vernacular. If the general government, okay, so let's go back to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Okay, right off the top of your head, what is that? No. It's what many call the elastic clause. They say, oh, this clause says that anything else we need, we can do as a government. I'm going to read it to you. Article 1, Section 8 says Congress shall have power to, and it goes all through these things that Congress has power to do. And then, I mean, it has everything from borrowing money and taxing and tariffs and the commerce thing, which the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement violates, the regulation of foreign commerce, okay? It didn't say, it says Congress has the power to regulate Congress for foreign nations. It doesn't allow Congress to delegate that to a trifecta of bureaucrats that are appointed by each of the respective governments and then decides how we're going to do commerce. No. Congress has power to do that. Okay, coin money and all that kind of stuff. Punishing counterfeits, that's one of the things, one of the laws that they can really enforce. But, so you go through, and through 17 is where they establish Washington, D.C., and it's restricted to 64,000 acres. That's federal land holdings. And then any others that they get by agreement with the states for forts and arsenals and ports and so on. Unconstitutional for them to claim ownership of a third of the land mass of the United States. It's unconstitutional, period. End of discussion. Read the 17th article again. The 17th clause of Section 8. Okay, so Clause 18. Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. What does that mean? These powers we already just listed? Okay. And for all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer therein. So they can carry out the things they've been charged with the responsibility to carry out. It doesn't say, oh no, you can do whatever you darn well please and we'll stick it under this thing. It says the foregoing powers and other powers identified within the Constitution. That's it. And the 10th Amendment, which we're just reading, says if we didn't delegate the power, they don't have it. Okay, can you see how this has been screwed up and we are now living in a post-constitutional world? Anyway, so by December 15th, 1791, 3/4 of the states ratified 10 of the 12 amendments. So these 10 amendments became the Bill of Rights. 2 of the proposed amendments failed to be ratified. They're still out there. They don't have an expiration date. I wonder. In 1992, 200 years later, one of the failed amendments was ratified and became the 27th Amendment. See, this was that 27th Amendment was in the original 12, and it said you can't take a raise as Congress until after you've stood for election again. That's what the 27th Amendment says. So it means that you can't vote yourselves willy-nilly raises and then take them and never have to answer the voters. If you voted for the raise, you can't take it until after you've been voted for again. Okay, now, do we care? Most people don't even know that they have that responsibility to look at those turkeys and say, no, you know what, you're kind of overpaid right now. We're not going to keep you in office. Okay, so that was one of the original 12. But it didn't happen until 200 years later, and it became the 27th, and now it is a part of the Constitution. One of them's still out there, okay? And it could someday be ratified and become the 28th Amendment, just like the 27th Amendment 200 years later became that. It's kind of interesting that if it were ratified, Congress would get really big. By some calculations, Congress would become a 6,000 unit organization instead of 435, which is what they've legislatively limited themselves to be. Now, I'm not going to try and sell you or convince you one way or the other on that, but just think for a second. Right now, most of you are probably in the 1st Congressional District, are you? Anybody else who's your congressperson, Congress critter? Burgess Owens is some, and more is the other. Okay. Okay, so there's a split within this group. But in whatever congressional district you're in, you're one of about 700,000 people that are in whomever's your congressional representative. If this went into place, they would have a limit and bounds on that would be in the tens of thousands instead of hundreds of thousands. And so you'd have better access. There are some downsides to this also. And how do you put 6,000 of these critters in one building and get them to work together? So there's a lot of things that need to be discussed before anybody got really excited about that. But some are really pushing that in the hope that your representative would be closer to you and more accessible, if that were the case. Well, we've gone through the Bill of Rights, kind of. Well, not it. It's just the process they went through to getting it. I've got to be out of here in 11 minutes. But if you wanted, I just first, what do you want to do, Enoch? Do you want to do questions, or do you want to look at some of the United Nations Bravo Sierra?
You could say that for another class. Probably.
Okay, because really and truly, we could get out in the weeds on what the United Nations is doing and how they really truly are planned tyranny. They have just the vaguest of resemblance to the U.S. Constitution and the vaguest of resemblance to these God-given rights. And they would have you believe that they're somewhat synonymous, and ultimately and finally it's all going to come out in the wash. But you're going to lose to the tyrants of the world if you implement the United Nations plan in place of the United States Constitution and our magnificent Bill of Rights. So if we're done tonight, and you all need to decide, maybe talk to Enoch, do you want to start examining Bill of Rights, or do you want to do the 14th Amendment first to see how it's so screwed up you can't see how it even happened, or do you want to try something else? So Enoch, do you want to lead the discussion, because I'm gonna bow out. Maybe.
Roe v. Wade and what's going on. That was federal, and now it's state, and everybody's screaming about that.
Yeah.
And then,
On my webinar every Thursday night, I do question and answer. Questions are submitted by people, and I make an attempt to answer them. Okay, I usually take longer to answer them, as you well might imagine, than most people think. It's not a yes or no issue, And most of those, right now, I've got probably about 700 videos we've made out of those answers that you can find things like that on. But maybe that's appropriate here too, so you guys need to discuss that. But I've got about, let's say, 700 videos of each individual answer, like, an impeachment question, or a Ukraine war question, and delivery of weapons to different foreign nations, whatever. I was deplatformed when I had 1,500 videos because YouTube didn't like my message. And so they all went away. But so I've had thousands, literally, these videos out there, and we currently have about 700. So, but if you guys want to go that route, but Enoch, I think you've kind of wanted to do baseline principles and constitutional things to this point.
Yeah, if you've got all those videos, that's a great thing to refer people to for deep dive on current events and that sort of thing. We'll probably keep going on the Constitution and the amendments here. I'm not opposed to those. I think once in a while we'll probably do events that maybe break the mold, special events, but in general we want to keep the class of the core basic things going.
I'm good with that.
Get the 14th Amendment.
Let me give you a microphone for the audience online to hear your question.
Oh, there's millions of people listening. It is an important
Well,
question.
I only care what you're thinking, Dr. Bradley, but I think if covering the 14th Amendment will help us to see the pattern that is being followed currently in the downfall of things, if it would be helpful us in recognizing this, that we should do that.
Okay. Well, I'll talk to Enoch later about that, but you guys, I'm here to try and assist any way I can. So I'm not proposing or anything more, and we could get to the 14th Amendment now or later in any way, shape, or form.
Where do we find your Thursday webinars?
Oh, that's the best kept secret in the nation. What it is, if you go to my website, freedomsrisingsun.com, about 2/3 of the way down on the home page, there's a little button you can click, and you'll put your email in, and then you'll get an invitation to each of those, probably until you're sick of getting the invitations. We send about 3 a week, saying in 2 days it's going to be, in 1 day it's going to be, and then it's tonight. Okay, so then you click on your invitation at 7 p.m. Mountain Time Thursday night, and you'll be in the webinar. And it's a kind of thing. If you've got any questions, you can type them in. Tamara will receive them and provide them to me. We did some live stuff at one point. Like people could say, I'll just give an example, one that came up. It wasn't exactly in this setting, but somebody wanted somebody assassinated. And it was probably not the appropriate thing to capture on something that could be referenced by the Secret Service. I mean, it was like, oh, I ain't going to go down that road. And we had to edit it out, actually. But if you type in the question, Tamara will receive it, and she'll give it to me while I'm doing the webinar. So freedomsrisingsun.com, that's the website. And then register for the webinar, and you'll get an invitation to come on board. Tamara. Or you can, well, if you go to BitChute or Rumble, you can find the 700 videos that are out there right now. What we do at the end of the event every Thursday night, well, usually it's on Friday, Tamara takes each question and puts the answer into a discrete video. So if there was a question about blah, 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 that's one video. They're usually 10 to 15 minutes long. And so then we title those and we put them on our BitChute channel or our Rumble channel. And if you go to BitChute or Rumble, the channel on BitChute. Well, actually what happened, if you go to bitchute.com, for example, or Rumble, and you put in Freedom's Call, no spaces and no apostrophes, Freedom's Call, you'll come into my channel with the 700 videos on it. Or you could go to Rumble, and my channel on that one is Freedom's Call 1787. So you get them on both those things. They used to just, we had 1,500 on YouTube, and they got erased. So we've got them on multiple sources now. So anyway, that's where we are. Surprisingly, it did. There was so much freedom of speech then, I mean, everybody was hunkered down and bunkered up with the lies that they'd been told on the COVID con, and they did not like my perspective on that. And so they erased me. Some people get doesn't everybody get 3 strikes, then they're out?
It's not as straightforward as that, but something like that.
Okay, well, in essence, I got 3 stripes on one answer, and they erased me on one answer, and we were gone, weren't we, Tamara? Everything that had been put out, 1,500 videos, labor of love, and just presto chango, gone. So it was about end of March 2020. Okay, on BitChute, you go to Freedom's Call, no apostrophe, no spaces. FREEDOMSCALL. And you can look up, it might say, the titles of each one of the questions is pretty self-explanatory. And if you don't understand it, go look at it anyway. So there might be some value there. I've taken adequate time maybe for what I was going to do. Enoch, do you want to talk or visit or?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and close out.
Do you want to come
Yeah.
up and do that? Okay.
Yeah, that'll be fine. And we'll go ahead and we'll dismiss Scott if he wants to leave to go to the airport. He has to meet someone there, so he's free to go if he wants. Or
pack here.
yeah, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. Yep. It's always amazing to sit and listen to Scott, and I always learn something new, no matter how many times I listen to him.
I make it up.
Yeah. But the message here is clear. What we need to do as a people, learn the wisdom of the founding era of this nation. Learn the wisdom, obtain it for yourself, and then share it. Okay, this information must be preserved. If we don't preserve it, if it doesn't find a home in our culture that's strong enough, someday, hundreds of years from now, people are going to have to rediscover these same natural truths from the adversity they will unavoidably go through. And so, as we're here and we're learning, even if you're not sure how to apply it, there's so much value in you just preserving it, okay, and then passing it on, if nothing else. But that said, if we preserve it with enough people, there's always a fraction of people that are just like, well, now what do I do? What do I do about it? What do I do with this information? And there can't be those doers if there's not enough of the preservers, so to speak. Okay? So what you do with that information, that's kind of been what I've tried to solve in my experience in Liberty over the past 10, 15 years. And it's ultimately culminated in this manual that we put out in order to share with the country, with anyone that wants to read it and listen. And so from our humble little corner of the world, we're hoping that we can take this kind of knowledge that he shares with us and find practical tools to implement it, to explore that. And what you do with this knowledge, you preserve it, but you can form a group, what the founders might call a committee of correspondence, a committee of some kind that became the subject matter expert on how the law is supposed to work. When people run for office, generally in this country, maybe 100% of the time, there's no training manual. Oh, now that you're in office, great. Here's the Constitution. Here's how it works. Here's how it applies to your job. That doesn't exist. In fact, there is training from entities that don't love and appreciate the Constitution that will train representatives the wrong way. So who is going to inject the correct ideas of government where they belong? This is where, once you get beyond learning it, if you have an itch to do something about it, now that you've obtained the message of liberty, you can inject it where it belongs, or at least try, make an attempt. And so you can do that alone, or you can do that with a group in your community, a group of passionate individuals. And we're not talking about a group that necessarily, not the traditional political things, run for office, beg your legislator to do the right thing. We're talking about create relationships with the right people and hope somebody's listening and find the people that will listen. And I don't want to embarrass you, Pam, but once in a while, people are paying attention, or people that are interested, that want to do the right thing, who are in office somewhere and they want more information on what to do. Who is going to be there? There need to be groups of people that are available with this information when people want it. And so in the audience today, there's someone that reached out to me from a city council a couple of years ago, and in time was able to make a difference in her community because of the understanding of how the Constitution works. And you're welcome to comment if you want to. I don't want to embarrass you, but it's a great story, and it's a great example of how much power we have to make a difference in the little things. You can talk after if you don't want to be on the mic, or it's just up to you.
Okay, so I serve on the city council in a very small town in Cache Valley. And so before I was even on the council, the health department forced our city to go sewer because we were on septic tanks. And with the septic tanks, we have single family homes on third of acre lot sizes. Now that the sewer is in the process of being installed, we have all of the developers just waiting to pounce and circling and coming to our planning and zoning. And I am over our planning and zoning. So we had the mayor of our neighboring city who owns property that's 50 acres in Millville. Sorry, I just named the town. And and then the rest of it's in her town, and wanting to either do a boundary line adjustment and take it out of our city so that they can do 750 rental high density apartment units on that piece. Or we had the discussion of, would it be better to keep it in our city so that we at least have some control? So I contacted Enoch. He was a huge help. It was also going to be a PID, which is Planned Infrastructure District, which the developer bonds for the money to put all the infrastructure in, and then the people who live there have to pay higher taxes. So anyway, I did write some code for our city to just not allow PIDs. It didn't really go anywhere. I was disappointed there. Nobody on our council was for them, but they were just afraid of getting sued. I hear that a lot if we put it in our code. But anyway, they did. When we finally had to come to the vote, like we put this off for about 1.5 years of whether or not we're going to allow this boundary line adjustment, it did go the way I wanted it to, which was no, we do not allow that adjustment. No, we do not allow that development. So, and we'll see what happens. We haven't heard anything.
And mention what I see almost a cherry on top of the whole thing in the notes. How you reference the state constitution and the reasons you put behind your no, and how you stood on that.
Yeah, which I got the information from Enoch. This is why I'm coming here, because I need to learn the Constitution better. So one thing that he pointed out was the PID, you're mixing public funds because you're higher taxes, which benefit a private entity. And so that's unconstitutional. There's the fact that it's a sitting mayor hiding behind a relative to develop this property, which also would mix public funds to put in infrastructure for her benefit. And there were numerous other things.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
So there's a lot of fear in small towns. This is very common. This isn't just one small town. This is happening all across the state. And the most common thing that you hear from people that want to push back is, well, the governor said we have to, or someone's going to sue us, or there's all these fear things being thrown at you. But things like the governor says you have to, there are some laws passed that make it look like the state can force the cities to do certain things. Now, sometimes they can, sometimes they can't, right? This is a question of enumerated powers in our state constitution on what they are allowed to do or not do. But it is not true that they can universally tell the cities anything and they have to obey. So what is the power of the local representatives to say no? Well, it's the state constitution. When they take their oath of office, they are empowered by the people with a law that is above the governor. And then with that, if they can cite this constitution in their reasons for saying no, their power is above the governor. But you have to know what it says. You have to know what it means exactly. So that's why obtain the knowledge as a people and then find opportunities to share it with those who are seeking it. And you find these small wins. There's not going to be a KSL news article about the small town that shut down high density. You'll never hear about it in any media from the mark of the beast system, as this one YouTuber used to call it all the time, right? The beast media. So that is why we're here, to obtain the knowledge. And then for those that are truly interested in what do I do? If I wanted to dedicate the rest of my life for liberty, should I join this party? Should I join this advocacy group? There's 1,000 things you can do. A lot of them are set up to steal your power, energy, and money and make you feel good. but a lot of them, there's a lot that are decent and good and doing some good things. But if you're trying to preserve government, that's why I put this together from a very practical view, from an engineering brain. How do you go about trying to preserve the mechanism of government? And we talked a lot about in the beginning about, I'm going to wrap up here in a second, but we talked about a Republican form of government, how in the Federalist Papers, how important they knew that was. You cannot violate the fact that we are a republic. That means so little other than an exciting thing to say to most people, even who love this country. Well, when you read the definitions, there are mechanical, specific reasons of what a republic looks like. That is why, even with the PIDs in the districts, it is violation of Republican form to mix public-private boundaries. Oh, I didn't know that. And when you start learning these things, you can identify it everywhere. And now people can start to become empowered on how they say no. It doesn't matter who's in office, or, I mean, to a point it does, but what little power we have, little control we have over that in this day and age. In a small town, I think that's definitely different. In some small towns, for sure. But so by learning how a Republican form of government works, to me, that is the fundamental first step to preserve our nation and start identifying where we're not following republicanism. It's in. I have a few videos on this too on our YouTube channel. So anyway, thank you all for coming. I'll invite anyone on this website, committees.us. You can read a little bit about that. And on our website, I'll plug this real quick for the video and online. We have 2 classes that we prepared for those that have learned and gained enough and are antsy to, well, what do I do next? If you are one of those people, then if you go to defendingutah.org/solutions part 1, that's all one word with the number 1, and then solutions part 2, that's kind of the next steps to sort of go a bit deeper on what to do. So thank you again for coming. We'll see you guys next month, and have a good weekend.